Welcome to our fourth and final module, Green Bay SLPs. We appreciate you sticking with us throughout this process. And our fourth module will be about criterion-referenced curriculum-based tools that we can dig into a little bit more. Just an overview for this week's module, we are going to be reviewing a functional framework that we can be using to look at the curriculum during our evaluations. We'll talk about various types of curricular-based assessments, contextualized assessment, and academic activities that we can look at. And then we'll end with a couple case examples and review that application activity for you. This framework, Riot and ISIL, comes from interventioncentral.org from a How RTI Works series by Jim Wright, 2010. And DPI also recommends using this framework within comprehensive evaluations. So the complete detailed document from DPI will be linked on our Google Drive for you to review in more depth if you wish. Right now, I'm just going to kind of go over a brief overview for you. Riot and ISIL is meant to be a flexible framework or matrix to guide and support teams in gathering information from a range of resources and perspectives, and then investigate the possible explanations or root causes for academic, social, or behavioral difficulties a student may be having. It notes relevant information to gather, and it can help teams organize that information to really dig into those possible underlying root causes of challenges a student may be experiencing. As you can see in that horizontal top row going across, we have RIOT, so review, interview, observe, test. And these are 4 potential sources of student information so that we get a variety of sources. So review is really looking at past and present student records, which many of us already do when we're in that pre-referral and that referral, a review of existing data stage. Interview. This is when you interview a variety of teachers, different school staff, the student, as well as the family to learn more about maybe what's going well and some challenges that might be happening. Observe. That's a direct observation of the student's skills and strategies that they may be using or not using. And again, with the new criteria, this is a really important part of our evaluation and required. Test. This is when you look at certain hypotheses for why a student is struggling and what supports they may benefit from. So this is going through and doing some of our standardized tests, our dynamic assessments, our language samples. So it's really things that you're already doing. It's just maybe a different way to look at it. If you look at that vertical column going along the side, that left-hand side, we have ISIL, so instruction, curriculum, environment, and learner. These are those 4 key domains of learning to be assessed. So we can look at where difficulties might be happening outside of just the learner or the student. So we can get a full range of relevant explanations as to why the student is struggling. And we can really dig in and examine and consider a lot of different reasons. So instruction relates to those instructional practices and teaching strategies that may help or hinder success. So for example, let's say you have a classroom teacher who's really awesome at activating prior knowledge before moving into content, and that really helps the student. That's really good information to have. And maybe there's another teacher who doesn't do that as well, and we see that the child might struggle a little bit more in that content area or class. Curriculum. This gets into those knowledge and skills that students are expected to learn. So it's those goals for teaching and learning. It's going to be the standards, the materials, assessments and activities that a district chooses to use to meet those standards, things like that. Environment. This is factors in a student's school, community, and or home surroundings that can help or hinder their success. So maybe a student does not have a very good home environment that's conducive to doing homework. So our student never does homework. That's good to know. Maybe the student is struggling with transitions in the hallway between classes. And maybe through an observation, we notice that it's due to some of the peers they're surrounded by. And by simply making a change in that, we see more success. And then learner or student are student qualities, unique capacities and traits specific to that student. So it could be things like their attention or lack of attention, maybe their study habits or their test-taking skills, self-efficacy, things like that. So many of you already know or do a lot of this within your evaluations. Riot and ISIL just provides a different view or a framework view to kind of reference and organize information within, and to really ensure that teams are getting that comprehensive view of a student. So I know that this framework could be familiar to some of you, maybe it's new, could be a little bit overwhelming, but by the end of this module, you'll see how we can use a small portion of it going through kind of that Riot piece with curriculum. Now that we have that broad understanding of Riot and ISIL and using that as a framework, we're going to focus in on Riot and the curriculum aspect of ISIL to support us in using criterion-referenced curriculum-based tools such as curriculum-based assessments, academic activities and artifacts, as well as contextualized tests. In the context of the curriculum, the question that we are asking is not whether the student is learning grade-appropriate curriculum, but rather, do they have the speech, language, or communication skills necessary to learn the curriculum? So does the student have the necessary skills to learn the curriculum? Nelson 2010 provides some more guiding questions to think about this and determine if the student has those necessary skills. So first, we want to know what language skills or what skills are required to complete a task. What does the student need to be able to do? In other words, what is the context, or in the context of a curricular task, what is the expected response? And this can be done through reviewing the curriculum, interviewing a teacher, interviewing the student, and then observing. Next, we want to ask the question about the student's current performance. So what does the student currently do? And this can be done through interviewing a variety of people in that student's life, so maybe their teacher, their family, and even that student has great insight. We can gather information about this from observations, and we're going to get information through testing, which is going to include the variety of tests that we might do. The third question we want to ask is, what does this student need to maybe learn to do differently? Okay, this is where we're going to compare that expected response, what skills are required, with the observed response, what is the student currently doing? And we're going to determine that mismatch. And if there is a mismatch, we want to dig into why. This is also where we need to be culturally responsive to our students' needs and determine if this mismatch is due to culture and or linguistic mismatches, or if it might be more indicative of a possible disability. And this is where tools like dynamic assessment are going to come in super, super useful so that we can figure this out a little bit better. And we are going to gather that information again through interviewing, observing, and then testing. That last question is really serving as a bridge to that observed response and expected response, and exploring how can we make some modifications to the curricular task, the curriculum, or that broader context to increase the student's success. So it might be things like, do they need more time? Do they need some pre-teaching of vocabulary? Do they need a graphic organizer? Could we rephrase directions? So thinking about modifications that can be made within the broader context to support success. So what are some examples of curriculum-based tools that we might go to? We have a variety of tools that we can consider, and all of these tools should be tied to some sort of standards or have determined objectives that are being addressed within them, which is often the standard. So first, we might look at some published curricular options. These are going to be things that come with the curriculum that the school district has chosen to use. And they're going to have a variety of assessments that teachers might be using. They could be more formative in nature. So maybe after completing a science lesson on the plant life cycle, students are instructed to draw a concept map to demonstrate their understanding. Maybe the assessment is more summative. So at the end of a math chapter, a math unit, there's going to be some sort of test that a teacher gives to see where students are coming out with their learning. Teacher-created assessments are very common as well. So maybe based on the curriculum, the materials the teacher is using, a group or grade level has decided to create their own based on standards, based on learning, how they want to see students progress. This could include reading running records. Maybe they have created their own letter sound knowledge assessment to be specific to pieces of information they want to know about, or maybe it's something like a rubric, and these are often common in writing. It could be academic activities and artifacts. So maybe it's getting different assignments that students have completed and discussing what the expectation, the criteria was from the teacher's perspective. It can also be contextualized tests. So this is going to include things like the STAR, maybe the forward exam, different things like that. Here is an example of a published curriculum-based assessment. Based on Haggerty, they have some different published materials that teachers use to work on those pre-literacy, those early phonological and phonemic awareness skills. And these assessments are available online for free, and they give you some different areas to assess in phonemic awareness and different criteria to look at. So this might be something that your district or teachers are using, or they may have something similar but a little bit different. Here's an example of a teacher-created rubric in the area of reading. So this could be something that a grade level, a group of teachers works on together, and they have some expectations for fluency, comprehension, retelling, and at the top you'll see their criteria are listed as beginning, below, meets, exceeds. You could even add points 1, 2, 3, 4, and they list out their criteria or what's expected. So an area we might be interested in is that comprehension, retelling. So if we look at where a student needs to be to meet that criteria, they need to be able to tell most key facts and the main idea, and mostly in a sequential order. So this could be something like a kindergarten, first or second grade rubric that a group of teachers has created. Here's an example of an academic activity. This is a writing sample from a second grader, and this was in response to the teacher saying, write about an animal within a habitat that we've learned about in science class. And we can see that this student stayed on topic about white sharks. They said that they like them, they like how they swim and are in the water, so they have a little bit of detail, maybe need some help expanding those details. And we can see they kind of use run-on sentences, so maybe need some support with syntax or something like that. Then we have some contextualized assessments, and these are often referred to as curriculum-based measurements or CBMs. So these are different than curriculum-based assessments because they're not always tied to a specific curriculum, and they measure students' academic growth along with evaluating the effectiveness of classroom instruction. So curriculum-based measurements, or CBMs, are a simple set of standardized procedures that are used to obtain reliable and valid measurements of students' achievement. So there's a few examples listed on the slide, but there are a lot more options out there. And CBMs generally measure a variety of areas like math and reading. They can be computer adaptive tests and make automatic adjustments throughout testing. So I know the STAR does this. It can measure performance and growth towards benchmarks and standards that districts assign. And it can predict student performance on high-stake tests and show trend lines. So I know the STAR can be somewhat indicative of how a student might do on the Wisconsin Forward exam. It can also inform teaching and learning at a class level as well as an individual level. And sometimes you can use these assessments from a criterion-referenced lens as well as a norm-referenced lens, depending on how the data is being collected and analyzed. So I do know within your district they use the STAR assessment, so that could be a great place to dig into some contextualized assessments with your teachers. And you can also ask your teachers what else they use. And these tools, such as the STAR, often have really great reports. So you can see kind of an overall score. Maybe they fall in that red, yellow, or green or blue benchmark area. But if you dig in more to just that score, we can often get some insight as to what skills they might be missing and where instruction needs to go next to get them to those standards and expectations. Whenever we're doing any type of assessment, we always need to consider that role of language differences and associated linguistic and content biases that occur within our assessments. So linguistic bias refers to that disparity between the language used on the test or task and the language or dialect used by the student. And that content bias occurs when the test stimuli reflect the assumption that all students have been exposed to the same concepts, the same vocabulary, or have had similar life experiences. So linguistic and content biases associated with tests and tasks or in our curriculum-based tools and assessments raise the question of whether poor performance results due to academic difficulty or a linguistic difference. So just some really brief examples of things to keep in mind when you're doing some criterion-referenced curriculum-based tools is certain vocabulary words might be challenging. So for example, in one study done by Newkirk, Turner, and Johnson, they found that home vocabulary can actually be very challenging in math word problems for some of our EL students because they're more likely to know these words in their native language rather than English, limiting their exposure to English, making those words less familiar to them. So even though those words might appear on these commonly frequently occurring word lists, it doesn't apply to all students, especially students who come from that diverse background. Another example is grammar. There was a study done on children who speak AAE and how they infrequently produce S in the third person singular context, and they may not comprehend it as a generic and verbal marker. So when they're doing math problems, math word problems that include these grammatical structures, it could be more cognitively tasking and a barrier to their success because of that dialect mismatch. And there's many other examples and many other considerations to take in when we're doing assessments, but we need to be keeping in mind linguistic and content biases that impact our student performance on various assessments and how it can interfere with the accuracy of our assessments, making it difficult to determine if students truly have the academic difficulties or if there's maybe that difference. And again, that's where that dynamic assessment is going to be key for us too. And this is also why that RIOT and ISO framework is useful, so that we're being culturally responsive to all of our students and we're getting that holistic picture by gathering information from a variety of sources and a variety of learning domains. Into two case examples for you. So here we have Julie, who is a 6th grade student due for reevaluation, and this is a team reevaluation due to the increased demands she's experiencing within middle school. And if I kind of go through RIOT and look at the curriculum, we can see that first I'm going to review student records. She's been receiving speech and language since kindergarten, working on grammar, vocabulary, and organization. So I'm going to see, is there anything new or different that maybe I'm not aware of? I'm going to conduct some interviews. So from talking with Julie, I find out she's feeling overwhelmed, writing is hard, and sometimes she's just not sure where to start with assignments. Talk to her teachers. They say they give her multiple attempts at writing assignments so she can meet the expectations. In her oral and written language, sometimes she's missing information, she's disorganized, and they do notice those grammatical errors, and she does appear to be behind her peers. Talking to her family, they also share that she's overwhelmed and she has difficulty understanding tasks. If I go into observation of the curriculum, so I go into the classroom during social studies, I see them working in small groups, and I note while they're engaging in a discussion about the content they had just learned, she's using non-specific language 15 different times across 10 minutes, and sometimes her peers are confused. So kind of keeping track of that academic vocabulary she's using within a conversation. Moving over to testing and understanding the curricular demands. Okay, I did 2 standardized assessments. The self 5, I see that she got a standard score of 81. I look in the manual and that cut score that gives us the best sensitivity and specificity is 80, so she's right on the cusp of it. I do the TNL, her standard score is 85, cut score is 92, so she's lower, and that would make sense given some of the concerns. And then I really want to dig into a curriculum-based assessment and academic artifact, and that's going to be a writing sample and a rubric. Get back from her teacher in terms of a writing rubric. If you're not viewing this in full screen mode, I highly recommend it so that you can see this better. We can see that 4 is that gray area, and that's meeting expectations. And then the yellow highlights are where Julie is falling. So we can see that she is below expectations in various areas. They need to have main idea and details. She's staying mostly focused, but not having all the details needed. Good intro and conclusion, clear sequencing and transitions. She's got some paragraphs, not great introduction, conclusion. Sequencing is a little bit challenging and attempts transitions. The teacher wants them to use, literary devices, complete complex sentences, develop that writing more. She's using basic vocabulary, little awareness of the audience, so maybe not using quite complex language. We look and see her capitalization, punctuation, spelling is generally meeting expectation. That's good, but we still see some errors with that grammar and run-on sentences. So now that I have done a little bit of my testing and observations, I've collected that curriculum-based assessment. Now I'm going to reflect on Nelson's questions for curricular demands. So I'm trying to think about, does the student have the language skills necessary to learn the curriculum? So first, I'm going to look at the skills that are required. I might pull up a couple standards, or I look at what the teacher has shared with me, and I can see speaking and listening. They need to have logical order, main ideas, details when they're talking and writing, language conventions. They need to be using correct grammar and more complex sentence structures. Okay, so that's what's required. Next, I'm going to reflect on, what is Julie currently doing? She's on topic most of the time. She has some relevant details. She's attempting transitions, and the teacher shared she's using basic vocabulary, sometimes starting to use academic vocabulary, so that's good. And she's using some writing mechanics or conventions like punctuation, capitalization, working on spelling, so that's good. And then I'm going to look at, what could she learn to do differently? What's that mismatch between the skills required and what she's currently doing? And I can see that she needs some support in narrative and expository skills, organization and sequencing, as well as vocabulary, and then that complex syntax. And then 4, what are those modifications that could be given to her to increase her success? Some things we might consider is if she did some sort of brainstorm or think aloud before writing activity and filled out a graphic organizer with some support for planning and sentence starters, could we see that oral and written language bridged together for higher success? If she's given a vocabulary word list as support, whether it's in an oral discussion or in a writing assignment, does that help her be more successful? So overall, when we kind of converge the evidence that we've collected so far, we can clearly see that she does not have the language skills to master the curriculum for 6th grade students looking at those state standards. So there is that significant discrepancy between her performance and what's expected, and there is definitely that educational impact. We can see that she's struggling within those discussions, those interactions with peers, as well as in those assignments. So by doing this and kind of reflecting on her curriculum-based assessment, looking at it through that Riot lens and the Nelson's guiding questions, this gives us an opportunity to really develop goals that are aligned with the curriculum and possibly utilize curriculum-based interventions so that her goals are really functional and based on that participation model within the classroom. Here's another case example of a student. His name is Zach. He's a little bit younger, in kindergarten, and this is an initial evaluation for him. So if we kind of use that Riot and curriculum guide to go through, we can see we might review his student records and look at any past, present information. Is he in any interventions? Is there any history of birth to 3 or anything like that? We can also get that information through interviewing various people in his life. The teacher had referred him for some speech errors, some difficulty understanding him. Maybe it's impacting reading. She's not really sure. And the family said some sounds are hard for him, but they're not sure if it's a big deal. But they did want to move forward with a referral just to check it out. And then from talking with Zach, he said he feels pretty good about himself. So then we move into an observation. We've gone into his classroom during small group reading activities, and we can see that he's participating. He appears to enjoy talking. There really doesn't appear to be any difficulty with peers understanding him. Then we move into that test phase. We do a standardized assessment. That CAP 2, we're looking at those speech sound errors. He gets a standard score of 77. So, okay, that score might be a little bit lower, but that's only one little piece to the puzzle. So then we decide to collect some classroom writing samples to look at those possible connections with speech sound errors and spelling. And then we dig into a curriculum-based assessment, and this teacher uses the Haggerty assessment. Assessment is that assessment of phonemic awareness skills. And as you can see, there's a variety of tasks that we're looking at. And then we have Zach's scores on the right-hand side. And there's criteria there at the bottom of the slide. And we can see that a 3 to a 4 is developing, 5 is proficient, and the teacher shares that most kids should be at that 4+ at this point in the year. But we're not quite at the end of the school year, so some of those lower scores might still be okay because they'll do it again at the end of the school year. So if we kind of briefly glance at this, he's got mostly 4s, and then we look at those 3s, so adding initial phonemes, deleting phonemes. Okay, so he's at a 3, still developing, not significant concern. So this is that published curricular-based assessment tool that we've kind of dug into, and it's overall showing us that he has some pretty strong phonemic awareness skills despite some speech sound errors. So that's good information to have and view within the broader context of this assessment. Now that we've kind of gone through that Riot curriculum review of Zach, and we've gotten that curriculum-based assessment, I've done a little bit of testing and observation. Now I'm going to reflect on if Zach has the necessary speech and language skills to learn the curriculum. So that first question, what skills are required to be successful within the curriculum? The teacher has given me 2 standards to reference, speaking and listening. So they need to be able to participate in classroom discussions, ask questions, things like that. And then there's those phonological awareness skills. So recognizing and producing rhyme, some blending and segmenting, some isolating of sounds, and addition, deletion, substitution of some sounds. So the skills that are required are those. And then I want to look at what is Zach currently doing. So he is attempting to participate in activities in the classroom. He is responding to teacher cues and prompts within those phonemic awareness activities, which is awesome. Then, what does he need to learn to do differently? What is that mismatch between those skills required and what he's currently doing? So he does have some difficulty with speech sounds, and we do see some of those phonological phonemic awareness skills might be a little bit of a struggle, but he's responding with cues and prompts from his teacher. So the mismatch doesn't seem to be significant. So then we're going to think about what modifications could be provided to increase his success. Now this does not mean through an IEP per se, but rather within that classroom, what kind of modifications could we consider and what level of support might he need? And we're going to explore that through our evaluation so we can feel more confident saying, if there is an identification of a disability or not, and if this would require specially designed instruction through special education. So He's responding to cues and prompts within phonemic awareness activities. We're going to check out stimulability. We find out he is pretty stimulable. We do some coaching with that classroom teacher and say, hey, when you're doing some of these activities, see if you give him a few prompts or cues and how he responds. And the teacher decided to do some one-on-one or small group, and she's trying it out and finds out, hey, he's responding fairly well. Great. Maybe the teacher does a little bit of extra auditory bombardment too, and throughout your evaluation window, maybe you do a little bit of trial therapy as well, so that you can feel more confident about stating if there's an identification of a disability or not. So when we kind of converge the evidence that we've collected so far, we've done that review of existing data, we've done some interviews, observations, we've done some of that testing, we've looked at curricular-based activities, we've tried some things out with the teacher, we can see that he is stimulable, he's responding to prompts and cues at a lower level, minimal support, he can get some of that extra practice for those phonemic awareness skills within the classroom, so that's awesome. So we're not really seeing a significant discrepancy in his academic skills and that functional performance. Yes, there are some speech sound errors, but he is stimulable and he's responding to cues and prompts, which is great. Which then leads us to, there is not that educational impact for this student. He can still make progress academically and functionally. So here we've kind of put together what we have so far and showed that this student really should not be identified with a speech language impairment. Now that we have learned about RIDE and ISIL, we've talked about a couple different options for curricular-based tools to explore, we've used those guiding questions from Nelson, we can really see we get a lot of value added from curriculum-based tools. We can really understand the nature of the language demands in the classroom, both oral and written. When we look at the curriculum, we connect it to the standards, we can see what's required, we can identify those mismatches, and then we can dig into the student's ability to handle those demands. What's challenging? What facilitates success? Which gives us great information for dynamic assessments. We can see what level of support does this student need, and is it significant or is it minimal, and just some simple modifications can be made for this student. Which leads us to that educational impact or lack of educational impact. And that really helps us make a better decision about if the student is identified and meets that criteria for a disability or not. And let's say that student were to meet and be identified with a disability, we have some really great information for potential intervention targets and goals with the curriculum-based information as well as the connection to the standards. So you can get a lot of awesome information from digging into the curriculum and using RIDE and ISIL and using those guiding questions from Nelson. Bringing this module to a close, we're going to go over that application activity. You will find a lot more detail on this in the module overview on the shared Google Drive. And we would like you to think about a student on your caseload that you'd like to learn more about. Maybe it's the same student you've been using, maybe it's a new one, an eval or due for re-eval. And we want you to work with one teacher to collect some sort of curriculum-based data that you could view through a Criterion-Referenced lens. So think about published assessments, teacher-created academic activities, a contextualized test, and see if you can kind of reflect on that with the teacher very briefly. And then we would like you to submit a brief write-up reflecting on those 4 questions from Nelson, thinking about the context of the curriculum and the language demands. What did you learn and what was the value added? How might you use this information moving forward? And if you have time, again, we don't want to make it too time-consuming or overwhelming, maybe try to connect to a standard or see if that teacher can give you a standard connection. So on the Google Drive, you'll find all of this information. We have those guiding questions from Nelson in a document. I linked the RIDE and ISIL more detailed document from DPI as well. And there is another useful document from DPI talking about comprehensive evaluations. If you haven't seen that before, you might find it useful. And then we will have a community of practice to kind of go over all of this information, share what you learned, share what went well, maybe what was challenging. And you are also welcome to schedule an optional coaching session to just share some insight on your activity or some feedback for us. So again, we cannot reiterate enough how much we value your time, your input, and collaboration throughout this pilot project. We hope that we've shared some bits and pieces of new information or perspectives that you found valuable, and John and I have certainly learned a lot from each and every one of you as well. So thank you so much. We're very grateful for your participation and your input. And as always, feel free to reach out if you need support throughout any point within this module.